Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another Fun Ideas podcast. And today we have a returning guest who has some new news for a project he's working on. It's Daniel Coston, and the project is concerning the 60s group called the Left Banke. And I know a little bit about the Left Banke, but part of this hour is so we can learn a little bit more, and maybe you can become a fan too. So welcome to the show.
Hey man, good to see you again. Welcome to 2022 and all of its adventures. So,
yes. I will tell you my history of the Left Banke. I mean, the two big hits they had, Walk Away Renee and Pretty Ballerina, slightly less so, but definitely Walk Away Renee. If you don't know the group, you probably have heard the song somewhere. It's one of those 60s classics that just gets played on oldies stations and things like that. But what I didn't know, and that's what we're going to kind of fill in the gaps of, is they did like 3 albums, I believe, 2 back in the day and 1 in the 70s or 80s, you can clarify.
70s,
and then
yes.
They did an album where they kind of put all the stuff from 65 to 69 together. But there's a few odds and ends, assorted other things. A couple recordings that I found weren't really Left Banke recordings. They're recorded under the name of Steve Martin, not the comedian Steve Martin, but they're kind of Left Banke recordings, and you can explain why that and explain how we got to the present day, and with no, unfortunately, surviving members as of 2020, so original members. So take it away.
All right. Well, the Left Banke story is complicated, but I will give you the Cliff Notes version as best I can. So the band did form in 1965 with Michael Brown, Steve Martin Caro, real name Steve Martin Caro, the singer, Tom Finn and George Cameron, and they coalesced at Michael's father's studio. His father was Harry Lakowski, who ran World United Studios. They started working on some songs with the drummer Warren David Shearhorst, who left within a few months. And they got together a few songs, including the song called Walk Away Renee. And the band had nearly broken up twice by the time they recorded the single. It was sold to Smash Mercury for $1,000 as a spec single, and didn't really do anything for a couple months. And then somebody in the Midwest started playing it. Within 3 months, it was top 5. It's now a standard, a classic that it deserves to be. And then the story of the Left Banke really began. They were pushed out on the road, even though some of them were still learning their instruments. They were collectively ranging from 17 to 15. Michael was going on 16 when he started. And so there was various fall-ins, fallouts. They did get their first album out early 67. Without Michael, largely they recorded Left Banke 2 in 1968, which I highly recommend. It's a great album. And they kind of wound down around 1969. As you mentioned, they did do some songs in 1971 under the name of their singer, Steve Martin. Again, real name Steve Martin Caro. And that actually is all the Left Banke. That is, songs are written by Michael Brown with Tom and George and Steve. But due to contractual obligations, they couldn't release it under the Left Banke name. So they did do another song, a song called You Say in 1972 without Michael. And then they kind of fell apart again, went in their separate ways, and then through Tom Finn getting a deal with a label or a publishing deal called with Cam America, they signed a contract to record a new album. And they went to Long Island and lived up there for 2-ish, maybe 3 months, recorded what were essentially studio demos for this album, which became Strangers on a Train. What you mostly hear now on Strangers on a Train was those demos. They did do a few songs with Michael Kamen in RCA Studios in around I'd say August of 1978. And then the project was essentially shelved and then was released on small labels in the US and the UK 8 years later. And after that, there really was nothing to speak of the Left Banke until they tried to do a reunion around 2001. It didn't work out, but Michael Brown soon reached out to Steve Martin Caro and started going down to Florida, where Steve was living by this point, and started recording songs. And around 2002, there was 2 separate sessions, one in December 2001, another in March 2002. And Michael released 5 of those songs on a small EP called Airborne. It was really, the intention of Airborne was they're going to do a promo pressing with the idea of picking another label would pick it up, but a lot of labels didn't know the EP was available, so it really didn't really be heard by anyone. Michael did release another 6 songs later in 2002, and that was heard by even less people. I don't think that was even officially printed, but it was pressed up on CDRs and handed out to a couple people. And you didn't hear about anything about the Left Banke again until Tom and George revived the Left Banke name in 2011 and up to 2013. How I got involved with the Left Banke was I discovered them in the 90s, loved them, and wanted to know what their story was, because there was always an air of mystery about the band. It was like, what's their deal? Why did they fall in, fall out? And then I started putting together an interview with the members of the band 2001, 2002. I believe it was finally published in 2003, and it covered all the things with Airborne that I just mentioned. And I stayed in touch with Tom and George, Tom Finn and George Cameron. And then I saw online that they were going to reunite and do these shows in Joe's Pub in 2011. I just said, I've got to be there. So I showed up and I think I bought a ticket for the first show. And then the second show, they were like, you're here, come on, stick around. And I kind of convinced, I didn't say convinced them, but I encouraged them, Tom especially, to say, this is fantastic. This is something I've literally waited my entire life for. Please do more of this. So they did for another couple of years. They toured with the Zombies in summer 2012. And then in 2013, they were going to do one more show. Tom was having back issues and there's a lot of things going on. I wasn't going to, I can tell you exactly the date. It was June 6, 2013. I wasn't going to go because it was my wife's birthday. And I really hated I didn't like leaving her alone. And Tom called me and said, you need to be here. Michael Brown's going to be here, please come. And then proceeded to email my wife and say, please, is it okay if Daniel can come and play with us? And then he wrote her back and thanked her later for basically letting me go up to New York and play with them. And I got to see the last public appearance of Michael Brown, Tom Finn. And after that performance, there was another version of Left Banke, briefly with George Cameron and a singer named Sam Cogan. And George and Steve Martin Caro were talking for years about doing something or trying to get some of these recordings that we just discussed out. And then George sadly passed away from lung cancer in 2018. Steve passed away in January 2020. Tom passed away after years of illness in June of 2020. I should mention too that Michael Brown passed away in 2015. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I wasn't sure if a lot of these recordings, which I had collected through the years, would ever be heard. And then I got back in touch with Cheryl Pavelski at Omnivore Recordings. And Cheryl and I met 20 years ago in a line for a show at South by Southwest. Wow. And the first conversation we had was about the Left Banke and Airborne. And somebody needs to release this. Oh my God, it's fantastic. And 20 years later, we said, well, why not us? So we went through the process. This record, which was just announced yesterday, was a journey. It was originally planned to be a 2 CD collection of everything of the band from 1968 to 2011, excuse me. And we realized that licensing all this was just going to be, it was near impossible. And maybe what we had found by this point, because we've continued to find new recordings or unknown recordings of the band as we were putting this project together. And I'll get into that as well. Mm-hmm. And we said, okay, let's focus on Strangers on a Train and the recordings that Mike and Steve did in 2011 and 2012. And that's the CD that we announced yesterday. Mm-hmm. It was not planned to be announced yesterday, but let's just say, much like the last 2 years, things don't always go according to plan. And it was a surprise release to all of us, but the response has been amazing. It is officially called Strangers on a Train with 6 recordings with Mike and Steve. You can also buy Mike and Steve's recordings as a separate EP titled High Flyer. And I am thrilled that people will finally be able to hear these songs correctly, not as a bootleg, not as a 10 times copied down version. These songs, this recording, I don't like hyperbole, as I'm about to say, but these songs have never sounded better. And I want to thank the person who did master them, which is Michael Graves with Osiris Studio. And it's been a journey. So, you know, my thanks to all the folks involved with the Left Banke, all the estates and everyone, and also Cheryl and Scott Schinder, who was my co-producer and wrote the liner notes. Scott was also involved in the 2014 reissues that Sundazed did of the first 2 Left Banke albums. So it is much like the Left Banke. It is hard to describe, but the journey is worth it. It has always been worth it.
Now, for anybody who hasn't seen the actual press release or hasn't seen the CD or anything else yet, how many tracks are on it, and what does it kind of encompass?
Yes, it is 16 tracks. The first 10 are the Strangers on a Train album. We actually went with the UK running order. We found that it flowed better. It allowed you to hear the songs differently. Plus, there was one song from those sessions that got foisted upon the band. It was a song that they did not write. It was actually the second song they had ever recorded they didn't write, and it was a disco song. They really didn't want to do it, but the money men made them do it. And in the UK running order, it pushes it to the last track on the album. So essentially, it allows us to put Queen of Paradise as the outlier that it always essentially was. So it is important that it's out there, that people hear it, but know that it was not the band's favorite. Then we have 6 songs from, the majority of the songs are from that Airborne EP, but then there's a couple other songs that they recorded in March 2002 that I just really felt deserved to be heard. One is called Buddy Steve. The song may or may not have been written by Michael Brown about Steve, but it is Steve singing about Steve. I will tell you that Tom Finn, who plays bass on the song, firmly believe that song was about Steve, even though Yvonne Vitale, who's Michael Brown's widow and mother's 2 sons, and thank you to all, thank you Yvonne and the kids for being so good to me. Yvonne has told me no, that song was not written about Steve. So as many things with the Left Banke, the truth is open to conjecture. But songs like that and Meet Me in the Moonlight, which Michael originally did with Ian Lloyd in the 70s. Hearing it sung by Steve Martin Carl, it's a whole new experience. And it deserved to be on this collection.
Now, obviously you said it was, you had enough for like 2 CDs and you had to pare it down. Was it mainly licensing that made your choices, or did you just truly go for the best, if you could?
It was licensing, but then we had to fall back on what we felt was the real gems of the collection. I mean, there's some things I really hope get released as a standalone release down the road. That's what I'm looking forward to. There's essentially 28 songs that Michael Brown recorded as demos with the Beckys, which was his Post Stories project. There were 3 records or bands that Michael Brown got involved with after he left the Left Banke. It was Montage in 1969, Stories, which some people know for the hit Brother Louie, although Michael was not involved with that recording. I do recommend Stories' first 2 albums, which Michael's a part of, and the Beckys. The Beckys included Jimmy McAllister, who later became the guitarist on Strangers on a Train. And for me, Jimmy is one of the glues throughout this entire project. He's on Strangers, he's on one song, Buddy Steve, on the High Flyer recordings. And it was important to have him involved. And so it was like, okay, let's pare this back. What do we want people to hear first? Strangers on a Train, the Airborne recordings, 01, 02. And we paired it back to that. But I would love to have a standalone release. The Becky songs, a few which include Tom Finn, are fantastic. We have found, yes, I mentioned Love Songs of the Night, 2x2. Someday Sony will let us license that. I look forward to that. There's some other songs. I will tell you that these are not all the recordings from the 01, 02 area. There is more. We just literally found more within pieces of more within the last 2 months, just as we were finishing the CD.
It's cool, actually, because if there's enough interest, at least you can say, hey, we got some more stuff here. So
exactly. And the thing that Tom and George always said to me was, Strangers never got a proper release. They did not consider those 86 releases proper. And they're right. They were kind of rushed out. It was Relics in the US, Bam Caruso in the UK. They sound very muddy. They sound dubbed down many times over. And one of the things, even though they're not here, one things I would like to think that those guys would be happy with me about in this project is that Strangers finally gets the attention and the proper unveiling that it deserves. And for me, but although it was not intended as a bookend, the recordings that Mike and Steve did in 01 and 02 are a fantastic bookend while standing on their own 2 feet. So it's I really look forward to fans discovering these songs and realizing there was much more to the Left Banke than what they've heard what they've heard before 1968.
Mm-hmm. Now, when was Strangers on a Train originally released? Was it 1986 or?
It was released in 86. It was recorded in 1978.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And you said it was kind of muddy sounding. So, I mean, what did you do to bring it up to, say, 21st century levels? Or what did everyone do? And if there was any overdubs or anything else in addition done to it?
Well, I will tell you that as the master tapes have been passed through many different companies, they now are, we license these through BMG, and BMG is still looking for the masters. I found a tape dub that was obviously probably dubbed over in the 80s or 90s, not from vinyl, from the tapes. I think it was probably a dub of a safety copy. And that was really the copy I was looking for. And thank you for agreeing with me on that.
Yeah,
and I actually have a copy here of the Strangers album from the US, and I had a dub version of the UK that a friend had given me many years ago. But when I found the tape dub that sounded clean, I was like, okay, we can work with this. So I sent it to Michael and said, go for it. And one thing that I also, somebody asked me today, is like, how much did you remix? Obviously remixing was not a possibility because we've not been able to find those masters. But even if we had, I'm not sure how much of these mixes I would have changed, because there was a lot of work that went into these recordings, both the studio and the sessions with Michael Kamen. There certainly was a lot of work into the recordings that Michael Brown did. Michael worked and worked and worked on his mixes a lot. And while we have found the Pro Tools for a number of those recordings, I wanted to respect his mixes as well. So their voices are still in my head, even though they're not here in this physical plane. They'll tell me when they think I'm messing something up. So I wanted to respect all their work, and I think that hopefully comes through in this release, which is out February 25th from Omnivore Recordings.
Very cool. Now, again, was there any sort of overdubbing, or is it just a nice, cleaner sounding copy of it? Is that what
it's essentially comes from a much nicer, cleaner sounding copy?
Okay. Because some people are like, what? That's heresy if you have any overdub at all. But sometimes you need to, like, maybe they didn't record a drum part for some reason. I'm not saying that happened, and it would sound better with one, something like that.
And sadly, everybody except, I should mention, I want to give a shout out to Charlie Caslett. Charlie was the bass player on Strangers from a Train. He's still out there, and I love talking to Charlie. Charlie was also the bass player for the 2011 to 13 Left Banke. So it was important to have him involved in this as well and continue his story. I know he's thrilled to finally see this album get a proper release. So would I have been loved to have been able to remix or have the guys add parts? I'm sure Tom would have said, yes, I want to do it. That was not possible for a number of reasons. So, okay, let's present this album as best we can.
And of course, you're of a biased opinion, but if anybody has the original version in any form, you should easily replace it with this one, or at least buy this in addition to that copy, because it's superior sound. So
I would agree.
Yeah, okay.
And even there's some collectors like, well, but I've heard Airborne. I got some MP3s from 20 years ago. Yes, you've been holding on to those MP3s for 20 years. That's again, these just I really wanted these songs to be heard with a clarity that they'd not gotten the chance before. And I really think that Michael and Omnivore really have pulled it off on this. But yeah, I'm slightly biased.
Yeah.
But I would want that too as a fan, to be honest. You know,
Yeah.
you want it when somebody says we're finally going to release this album. You don't want to sound just the same or worse than the dubs you've had for years. I'm going to also credit Andrew Sandoval for his work on the 1994 collection of the two Left Banke albums and additional singles that you referenced earlier. Michael, had the chance to do largely remix and clean up the first album. That first album is really essentially mixed for AM radio. It's very muddy, and Andrew did an amazing job. Again, he didn't add any parts to it, but he just gave it a new mix and a new mastering that it never had before. And for me, a lot of us, myself included, that is kind of that's how we hear those songs now, because like many people in the 90s, I picked up that collection and said, oh my God, what is this? Who is this band? Right. So I would like to think that whether you've heard Strangers and the Airborne songs or not, you would hear this and say, wow, I had no idea this existed. And hopefully, even if you do have it, you go, wow, I've never heard them this way before.
That's cool. Yeah. I mean, I even do that with bands, that we all know and love, Beach Boys, Beatles, Monkees, whatever, they're putting out Sgt. Pepper again, Let It Be again, whatever again, but, each time, they take care to do it a little bit better in most cases. I'll give credit, and sometimes I don't, but, in most cases, I would say, unless you're just an obnoxious purist and says, it has to sound like that old muddy 1967 mix or something, it's like, sometimes things work better sonically if you listen to it in this, for lack of a better term, a CD bandwidth. I mean, that's kind of an archaic term now, but I mean, there's so much dynamic range more than on an original vinyl record, even vinyl records made now, so.
Yeah, and just so many more options. And I know some people have asked, is there going to be a vinyl version of this? I think we're still working on that. I hope there's a vinyl version of this, obviously. The Collector and Me, oh, by the way, I should mention that for 20 years, I've been chasing a copy of the Montage LP, and I just finally got it last month. So, my collection is complete until this release comes out. So my kind of, one of the ways I've gone into this, working on this project, is what I'm doing is what I would like to see somebody else do. I mean, somebody else maybe looks like me, maybe doesn't, did the things that I've tried to do. I'd say, cool, that's always what I've wanted, and I'm just happened to be the one that's hopefully presenting these songs in their best light.
Now, since we did kind of the overview of their career and everything, there's just a few nitpicky questions that I'm concerned about or curious about, because we mentioned them and stuff like that. So they kind of had a few lineup changes even from 65 to 69. What was going on with them? Was it the typical in-group fighting, or was it issues with the label, or both, or management, or what was going on?
All of the above.
Okay.
First off, they met at a very young age, and the one way they knew how to communicate was by yelling at each other. And
so they're like the Trogs.
without the really colorful studio outtakes, but it's just how they communicated. Now I will tell you that each member of the band really did care about each other. They all really loved each other. They loved each other so much they kind of could drive each other crazy. And so some people did fall in, they fell out early on. As I mentioned, Warren left early on. George was switched from guitar to drums. They got Rick Brand on guitar, actually Jeff Winfield first, then Rick Brand. Rick's on the first album cover. And then they fell out with Harry Lakovsky. Michael left. Michael came back. They did the Desiree single. That didn't work for a variety of reasons, or it's a fantastic single. It may be my favorite Left Banke record, but it didn't hit the charts. Michael leaves again. They record Left Banke 2 as a 3-piece. And then there were, Smash, was essentially the budget division of Mercury. And, they had a lot of good people on that label, many of which are in my record collection over here.
Yeah.
But they kind of released a lot of things like, well, if it's a hit, great. If not, well, just that's another one on the pile. So
So, like, if they had done better, even though I still think they did pretty good on that first album,
yes.
at least. But if they had done better, would they have moved to Mercury proper, or would they have stayed on Smash? How would that?
If the record had not done well, they would have been done. You would have never heard from the Left Banke again.
Okay.
And from my understanding, things that Charlie's told me and some other stories, they really thought, well, that was nice. It was cool. We did a couple, I know they did a appearance in July with Cousin Brucey. They appeared on a couple small TV shows, one of which I found many years ago, and it's like the only footage I've ever found that has Warren David, a Shearhorst, in the lineup. But almost as though it was deemed to happen, somebody in the Midwest, and I'm fortunately not remembering the DJ's name, he started playing it. A few other DJs started playing it, and all of a sudden the song took off. That's the magic, one of the beautiful things about the 60s. You could create a great song in the right place in the right time. You could find an audience, and suddenly you're being lauded as part of a new wave of music. And Leonard Bernstein singled out Pretty Ballerina for praise on his Inside Pop show in 1967, and George Cameron told me he was watching that and cursed out loud when he saw that, because they did not see it. They did not know that was going to happen. Right. And they knew they were creating something different. They knew they were creating something special, but there were a lot of other forces that pulled them apart. In retrospect, it's amazing that they were able to do in that short span of time what they did. And despite their differences, they did get together here and there, although usually largely fleeting, did continue to create great music.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask about that too, but I just want to be a little more chronological. So it seems like in '69, for all intents and purposes, they were done. And what was the reason for that? Did they just want to call it a day, or did the label say bye-bye, or what was going on that caused that definitive break at that time? For at least
it essentially wound down. The phrase that Tom Finn told me is that it just wound down. It just wound down to stop. Steve was tired of touring. Steve eventually moved to California. They did continue without him for a short time, and then Tom got tired of it, left. George did the same. I think I'm going to mention a gentleman who I do miss dearly as well as Tom Fair. Tom wrote their latter singles, Bryan Hotel and Goodbye Holly, and toured with them at the end. And essentially, he kind of inherited the remnants of the Left Banke band. I think it had a variety of names, but it just continued on as his band for another year or two. They did do some recording in 1969. Tom pitched some songs to this movie called The Telephone Man, and recorded 4 songs, including 2 versions of Sing Little Bird Sing, which is on the second Left Banke album. And Tom was involved. Steve Martin was involved. It was the last thing he did before he moved away. And ironically, they went back to World United Studios and cut the strings with Harry Lukowski. So again, one of my favorite phrases, and was the working title for this CD, was "Everything Returns Again." And because I think that is the first line of Desiree. And it applies so much to the band's history and to life itself, really. So it's amazing, even though a lot of these folks just fell out famously within a year or two. Oh, hey, come back in and play on this. So just remarkable. So, and then they kind of like sporadically back and forth through the 70s.
Right. So what's the story on those 2 tracks from 1971? I always thought they were Left Banke songs, but then I found out that they were released under the name Steve Martin. What was it? 2x2 and Love Songs in the Night. I don't know which one was the A side, but
I believe Love Songs was the A side, but there is some debate about that. Okay. Basically, Steve moved back to town, and a lot of things lined up. They got Hugh McCracken, who was the guitarist on largely guitarist on the first Left Banke record, famous session guitarist, to play guitar on those songs. And Michael Rodham, the guy, sang and played all the instruments. And the management said, "Well, I think that name's still owned by Mercury." So those 2 songs were released on Buddha Records as part of a collection called Ultraviolet's Hot Parts. Essentially, it's not quite a porno, but it's leans that way. And there was those 2 songs released under the name Steve Martin. There's 2 montage songs on it. There's 2 songs from Bert Summer, who was the lead vocalist for the Left Banke during a very, very brief period in 1967. And it's a fascinating collection. But yeah, it's the Left Banke in all but name.
Okay, so it's a similar story. Like, I'm working on a Turtles book. I mentioned it every show and stuff like that. But where White Whale owned the name Turtles, and even their names, Mark Volman, Howard Kalin, that they couldn't use them right away. And so, yeah, they were under Flo and Eddie. Ironically, those same two tracks, Howard Kalin years later did covers of both of those tracks on his Dust Bunnies album in 2006, which is where I first heard them. And of course, when, Dust Bunnies had the effect of getting me to go and find what the original version sounded like of all these songs, so, that he was doing, because, they may be hits for him or, favorites for him, but most of them I was like,
where do you find this? Where did this come from? And it's always fun when people hear those songs and go, that's the Left Banke after 1968. It's like, yeah, they still had it. I had actually reached out to Mark and Howard when I was putting together the original Left Banke interviews for Big Takeover. I wanted some perspective, and I just emailed them both totally random and said, hey, what do you think of the Left Banke? And they both raved about those songs. And even then, like Mark said, I'm going to record this someday. And there you go. So actually, Howard said that. So it's always fun to hear when people discover these songs and how.
Did they ever tour together, the Turtles and Left Banke, or they just admired them?
They did a couple shows together in 1968. Tom Fair, I would think it was the first weekend that Tom played keyboards with them. And he remembered Mark rolling around the floor like a little kid. And it's a fascinating bill. I've never been able to find out the exact dates and where, but here's where another weird kink in that story is that show may have happened in Rochester, New York. And if that happened, my parents saw that show. My parents remember seeing the Turtles, but they can't remember any other acts on the bill. So someday, if I'm able to get a more information from the band's tour schedule, which is obviously the information is spotty at best. I would love to know if that's that show.
Well, going through the Turtles live thing, which I'm not really covering in depth too much. I mean, I talk about it in general terms in my book, but they did a lot of caravan tours, as it were, where they're just one of like 10 acts, and they go and do like one or two songs, and then you have Tom Jones and then Herman's Hermits and whatever. It was not like the Turtles in an opening act or something like that. And and they still do that now when they do their Happy Together tour. It's like 5 acts together or 6 acts sometimes. It's like touring around. And I don't know if the Turtles ever did a proper, like, we're the big headliners,
as opposed to the Left Banke, and actually that was to the band's detriment. The best shows, Tom and George both told me, the best shows they did was the shows where they opened up for the Beach Boys, which meant that they had a real PA, they had a shorter set, and which also meant they could do more of their own songs. And I know they did a similar show with Mamas and Papas. I think that was a one-off with the Mamas and Papas, and they spoke well of that. Most of the times, their management and booking agency put them out in essentially, glorified bars. Some odd gigs. I actually found some info that the Left Banke opened for the Temptations in Detroit in November of '66. I'd have loved to have seen that show. But most times they were pushed out on their own. With instruments that they were still learning. Michael had, I think it was the first prototype of an electric harpsichord, which apparently only stayed in tune for half a song. And I've heard that their shows were just utter chaos. And they did a lot because they were having to play 2 sets a night. They only would do their own singles. They didn't do album cuts largely. I've heard a lot of their set was Rolling Stones covers, whatever they were into at the time. Both Steve and George were huge Rolling Stones fans. So I wish they had gotten to do more package tours. I wish they'd done more touring with the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were really supportive. And I know George told me that Dennis Wilson wanted to manage them at some point. And they would sit on the side of the stage and sing their songs, and like the Beach Boys would sit there, watch it, and then sing Pretty Ballerina in 4-part harmony because they're the Beach Boys. I wish they'd done more package shows like that. And I think we'd have more documentation. of their shows. I think I have, in terms of high res photos, I think I have 4 to 6 total that I found. There's 4 that I found in the New Rochelle High School yearbook in 1968. Another show I would love to have been at. They did a show for that high school in 67 with the Critters opening, and I love the Critters. One of their autographed albums sits here on my desk. So, but yeah, it's everybody, depending on the management, depending on the label, depending on the situation, everybody had a different touring experience in the 60s. And if you were out there on your own, sometimes you had a PA, sometimes you didn't, sometimes you just, you ran 2 wires together and said, okay, this is what it is, and all without monitors. So yeah, it's different for every band that we've discussed on the show.
Now, for the Left Banke, its various members from like the 70s through up to, let's say, 2011, and then we'll talk about later than that. Did all the members, either separately or together, continue performing and live performance or recording, or did they all drop out for a number of years? Other than these recordings that we're talking about that you're releasing, of course, but was it just like after Strangers on a Train, it originally didn't work out in 78, it's like most of them just hung it up, or did they just keep going, just saying
they essentially hung it up? I mean, Steve Martin never played live again after 1969. He did do there's some recordings that you can find online of him and George and Sam Cogan running through some songs in Florida in 2018, but that was not a live show. That was essentially a workshop show, a private show. But Steve would not sing sing Walk Away Renee with any band. A number of bands tried to bring him on, and he was like, no, I'll sing anything else, but I'm not singing Walk Away Renee. And he always found a way to not take the gig on. So eventually he moved to Florida, and that's pretty much where he stayed until the end of his life. Tom Finn got into engineering. He was engineer at Bell Records. Engineered, including I learned recently the single by Gun Hill Road, back when my hair was short, he engineered that. Which I heard that recently is like they still owe Ben Folds 5 a pony, or Ben Folds 5 owes them a pony. So listen to that song, you'll hear what I'm talking about.
Well, how involved at Bell Records? I mean, did he do like Partridge Family and Fifth Dimension and who else? Tony Orlando? Or
just a couple of
Barry
years.
Manilow.
Yeah. Okay. He mentioned a couple names. I need to go back, but he was essentially kind of like, he would get called in to engineer various sessions. He then ended up working with Buddy Rich for a couple of years, emceeing his shows. Tom told me, he said, I learned a lot from Buddy Rich, and how about managing and how to handle yourself. Eventually, Tom got into DJing to the point where he DJ'd ball for Bill Clinton, some major weddings. I've heard rumors that he DJ'd McCartney's second wedding reception. And a lot of these, Tom largely refused to talk about because he wanted to respect the privacy of his clients. But he was featured in 2006 as one of the top DJs essentially in New York and the world. And you can find that article online. And that's what he was doing pretty much until he got involved with George and this version of the Left Banke that toured from 2011 to 2013. George was involved in various things. He got involved with a theater company. He told me about it one day over the phone. And of course, that was the one conversation he and I had that I didn't record. And I still wish I had more information about it. He was very proud of that theater company. And some of the plays that did involve songs from Tom Finn. And Michael Brown never stopped, even after the Beckys broke up. He essentially kind of retreated to his home and never stopped writing, never stopped recording. Worked on a few things with his wife, Yvonne. There are a number of recordings out there, and we're still finding more. For me, that's one of the real joys of the sessions that he did with Steve Martin Caro, is like you finally hear what he was trying to do in those post Becky's years, but then you hear it with Steve's voice, and it's like, oh, this makes absolute sense. It's like, it was like, one thing I really discovered in doing the research for this project was like, Michael was, he never stopped, until the day he passed away. He was always working on something. But there's a nice period from the late 90s to working with Steve and then Tom. he continued working with a couple other singers. He even worked with basically with those same people, including Tom and Jimmy McAllister, up to 2006. And we're still finding some of these recordings. There's more out there, and that's one of the things I look forward to still, after all these years and all these months of working on this project. I know there's more out there. I'm actually waiting on a package right now that might have a 45 of a solo Michael Brown recording that he did in 1966. As soon as I hear it, I'll know. Michael had a very distinctive sound. He was very heavy on the left hand. You hear that in the Left Banke recordings and other recordings that he did. So I know as soon as I hear it, I'll know within 8 bars whether or not it's Michael. Right. So even though this release is finally getting to come out, the work goes on. But yeah, as I mentioned, and there's still more from the Mike and Steve sessions that are out there, and hopefully the folks who are hopefully watching this will get to hear all this music sooner than later.
Mm-hmm. So jumping to 2011, I'm not sure much at all on their various reunions. So you said they're together, at least part of them were together 2011 to 2013. How did that come about? And was that on their own, or is that one of these package tours too?
No, it was really completely on their own. George Cameron had seen the Facebook page that Tom Finn was running. It's the Facebook page is still up there. And he thought, well, what if, his plan was, I'll form a band, I'll get Steve involved because I know Tom won't do it. And he got in touch with Charlie Caslett. He got together with Paul Alves, who was a guitarist for that band. And they started putting together a group, and Steve bowed out, stayed in Florida, and Tom got involved. So within a period of, within several months, they picked up Mike Fornatal, who many people know from many groups he's played in over the years. And his work to that band was so important. Mike does not get the credit or the love for being the lead singer, basically the person who's going to stand in and sing those Steve Martin parts night in, night out. I mean, it's not easy. And and that ended up being a great band. Tom and George were still live wires. Every show was a little different, but that was part of the fun. I never expected a Left Banke show to be perfect, but you expect it to be lively. You expected it to be surprising, because the music was surprising. The music was all these different colors. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed about those shows. It was like every night it was something different, and some nuance I haven't heard before. So, and it was, again, it's something I never thought I'd witness. The Left Banke in their history was largely unknown even to people like myself. And it's like, well, I can only imagine what it'd be like to see them live. Well, I saw a latter version 6 times. Right. And the last one was with Michael Brown coming out on stage to play Walk Away Renee.
Did they vary their set from performance to performance, or are they pretty much
largely that? Again, looking back at the set list, there was a song on Strangers called Lorraine, which was a personal favorite of Tom's. That was only done at the 2011 shows. When they played in 2012, they did I Can Fly from Strangers. That was another nice one to hear live at the final show that they did, that lineup did in 2013. They did Claudia, which was an outtake from Strangers that sadly did not make this collection due to some licensing issues. But every show was a little different. And they did Love Songs of the Night and 2 by 2 at those 2011 shows. That was fantastic to hear. And their shows with the Zombies were fantastic, because they kind of went out and said, yeah, you may be here to see the Zombies, but you're going to, be listening to us now. And they would do a 14-song set in 45 minutes. It was like, they did not like the term Baroque rock, but it was like, if there was such a thing as like Baroque goes punk, it was just hearing all those songs together in this short span of time was thrilling. It really was.
It is kind of ironic when you just mentioned the Zombies, and of course they toured together. They have like a similar history. They really only put like a couple albums out, and really have like 2 or 3 big hit songs, and then beyond that, you're like, unless you're a hardcore fan. Now, of course, Odyssey and Oracle is like considered an all-time classic, but anything that isn't even on that album is great on them too. So Do you find the same with Left Banke, that anything's worth discovery, that they never really did a bum track, to your knowledge?
And it actually I found the Left Banke, I'm sorry, the Zombies got better. I do like that first album. I love Odyssey and Oracle. I also recommend this LP that they were going to put together after the success of Time in the Season. It was going to be called R.I.P. And it was a number of songs that they had not finished, 65 to 67, as Walking in the Sun, a lot of things. I don't think it found an official release back then. Eventually was released in the 90s as part of the Zombie Heaven box set. But it was like, oh, wow, why was this never released? It was like, I think there's still some things out there we're finding. That's, again, the joys of the 60s. It's endless. Yeah. Just when you think you've heard it all, somebody comes along and says, oh, have you ever heard this? Or I just discovered this. And it's like, whoa, what's that? And that for me is RIP. So for the folks who love the Zombies but don't know RIP, highly recommend finding that.
I mean, I'm going to give a shout out to Andrew Sandoval again, because he has that Welcome to the Sunshine podcast. That's where I've learned a lot of songs and a lot of groups that I go. In fact, what I was doing for the longest time, and I should start doing it again, I just haven't listened to episodes for a bit, is I was listening to him and just jotting down titles and tracks. And then after I would listen to enough shows, I'd go on eBay and I'd scour the listings for 45s of those songs. And if they weren't ridiculously expensive, I'd order like 10 or 15 singles of songs. Hey, I never knew this was done by this group, but that's a cool song. Now I have it in the original format. So I'll thank Andrew for that.
Yeah, and happy birthday, Andrew, belatedly. And I should mention too that Andrew was the co-producer, one of the main people behind the Left Banke compilation in '94 that turned me onto the Left Banke. So I wrote him yesterday saying, thank you for making me do all this crazy stuff. I saw what he was doing. Oh, that's a good gig. And some years later, I find myself doing it as well. So and I do recommend Come to the Sunshine. I have discovered the Critters through that site, and the Honey Bus. Again, go search this music out. All these bands that you and I are discussing, Mark. It's like there's something in there for everyone, and that's part of
the thing I like also is, even if they play a group that you might like, like you mentioned the Rolling Stones or the Beach Boys or something, he'll do a show that'll be the more obscure stuff instead of the typical Pet Sounds or Surfing USA or whatever. It'll be something from Friends or 2020 or something even more obscure. Just the show that fascinated me, because I was never a huge fan, was the Four Seasons, where the early stuff everybody knows, Sherry, Big Girls Don't Cry, all that stuff. And then they did these really kind of psychedelic sounding albums in the late 60s, and it's like, whoa, because I know the early hits, and then I know the 70s comeback with the disco stuff, Oh What a Night and all that stuff. But there's like all these bands seem to have this lost year if they didn't transition well like the Beatles did. And it's really fascinating to discover that stuff, that it wasn't kind of necessarily flash in the pan. They actually really tried. Some were a little bizarre than others, like I think Rick Nelson even did stuff, and I forgot all the ones that did, but some of the results are fascinating.
Yeah. One episode he did was on Little Anthony and the Imperials, when it was just I think it was either just Little Anthony or the Imperials. And they basically kind of did a Left Banke-esque album. And it's very good. It's kind of stunning. I also will recommend The Fifth Estate, who some folks will know from Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Well, there was so much more to that band. And their producers were Steve and Bill Jerome, who produced that first Left Banke album. And their arranger was John Abbott, who arranged that first Left Banke album. So, it's again, the crate is endless, and that's part of what I enjoy about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, in doing a little research before this show today, is like, I noticed on Wikipedia, that bastion of accuracy that everybody loves, that there were kind of like two almost reunions with the Left Banke post 2013. And one they mentioned was in 2015, and one was in 2018. Can you go into more detail on those?
Well, that was after Tom bowed out of the band, and George formed a new version of the Left Banke with Sam Cogan, as I mentioned earlier. And their plan was to have Steve and Michael involved in that project. They were, in talks with both. And sadly, Michael passed away before anything could happen with that. They did perform at the tribute concert for Michael Brown in 2015. And then in 2018, they went down and they met up with Steve in Florida at old Dairy Down, which had been a venue that Graham Parsons had played in the early 60s, and essentially ran through and woodshedded a lot of the Left Banke songs. And if you heard any of it, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of talk, but the plan was, okay, this is the start, and then eventually we'll get Steve on board more, or we'll get him, to a point where he can do this live, and we can do this live with him. And then within a couple months, George came down with lung cancer and passed away, I believe, in May or June of 2018. And I received an email. I was in Winston. I can tell you where I was. I was in Winston-Salem working a sports writers convention. And I got an email from Tom Finn that said, Daniel, George passed away. And I just kind of had to stop. I just had to go back to my hotel room and just kind of, that hit me so hard because I didn't know he'd been ill. I didn't want to be around people, have them watch me break down. So, it was, that's the thing. Again, I mentioned earlier, I still hear these guys in my head, and I miss them dearly. I think any of those of us who knew any of these guys, we miss them dearly. But thankfully, what they did and what they created is on all these songs. Those songs will live forever. So there's a lot of almosts in the history of the Left Banke, and that those almost stretch as long as the band, the history itself. But thank God the music survives, and we're still finding more music. Yeah.
Were you at that 2015 show that you mentioned, or?
I was not, and I don't have a lot of regrets in my life, but I regret not being at that.
Yeah, well, especially considering what happened. I mean, since there weren't more opportunities after that, so.
I had invitations from George. I had invitations from Tom and George to be at Michael Brown's memorial, and I couldn't bring myself to be there, partially because I knew as a photographer, my other, one of my many other lives is still photography. I would want to meet and photograph all these people, all of whom I had always heard about, had never met. Like Renee was there, the lady that inspired Walk Away Renee was at Michael's memorial, and there's just not a place in a memorial like that for a camera. That's people have said, what's your limit? And that's my limit. But I would love to have been there, but I knew that it would be, and also some of the guys knew, like Tom and George knew me, but the family didn't know me as well at that point. So I didn't want to ingratiate myself that way. Now, I will say Yvonne has told me since, she's like, I met Michael and his family at that 2013 show at Joe's Pub. And she said, oh, Michael really liked you. He really liked talking to you. It's just like, that's mind blowing. As a photographer, you're taught, you believe to stay behind the camera and stay, kind of, don't overly, don't make too much of yourself, essentially. So when you hear things like that, it's like, oh, wow, I guess I did something good.
Yeah. So sometimes friendships develop. I mean, you never know. So
I've really treasured getting to know Yvonne and her family and all that. And hopefully I'm being a good steward for these songs. And I'm thrilled that we've been able to find so much that a lot of songs they didn't even know about. It's amazing when you suddenly start diving through these things and you go, oh my God, there's even more here than I even thought would be. One of the songs that we found recently from the 2001 recordings was a song that Tom Finn told me about 20 years ago. And one day on the phone, Yvonne mentioned that song, and I just stopped and I said, you've just answered a question I've had for 20 years. And it's true. So yeah, it's been like much of the last 2 years, it's been a journey, but what we have found and what we've been able to do on this journey has been wonderful. It really has.
Coming up to the present, since the original members are all gone, but there are some latter-day members, is there any possibility of any sort of group rising up from the ashes to use the Left Banke name, or is that all done in the past now because there's no original continuity. Some, you know, I'm saying more like something like the Coasters or something, or the Ink Spots, where they kept going even when they had no more original members and things like that. Or even Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship. That's an example. You know, they don't have any of the original members anymore, and they still perform. So
That's a good question. I don't know.
okay.
I think everybody who's involved, you know, the families of all the band members might have different things to say. For me, the Left Banke will always be those four guys
Yeah.
in various configurations. So I don't know, but for me personally, speaking for me personally, you know, those four guys will always be the Left Banke.
Yeah. I mean, I will agree with you on that. I was just curious about if there was rumblings, like if you're putting out a new release, hey, maybe we should get together and tour with something, you know, and, you know, kind of tour this album or something, even though it's not the official original members or something like that. But, you know.
Nothing that I've heard, nothing that I know of. But I do hope that this release, the Strangers on a Train release, with the High Flyer songs or the Airborne songs, allows for more releases down the road. Is it a year or two? Is it more years? I don't know. But what I have found in the searching for more recordings is there's much more here than I even knew about. As you know, I started this project as a fan of the band for 20 years. Right. And what we found in the last 18 months still amazes me. And we're still finding amazes me. So even if they're out on stage, I hope people get to hear these songs somewhere.
Yeah. I would say this, you know, like at least Walk Away Renee is enough of a, you know, iconic song that I'm sure there are cover bands performing that out there, you know, somewhere. But, you know, it's just a kind of an interesting thing, just because, you know, even the Beach Boys, we'll use them as an example now, they're introducing their sons. And, you know, it's like, it seems like they're trying to make it a family thing that once all the principals are dead and buried, you know, it'll continue on, that there will be Beach Boys mania, as it were, you know, and not all groups do that, but, you know, it just always curious.
No, and that's a hard line for those of us, you know, I was reflecting on this recently after Billy Hinchy passed away. You know, Billy was part of the Beach Boys band that I first saw in 1983. And while I still enjoy going to see Mike and Bruce as the Beach Boys, and I enjoy seeing Brian and Al and Blondie go out as Brian, it's different. So you kind of, like anything in life, everything, any group, any situation is a little different. So I think it works for some groups. I'm not sure it worked for groups like the Left Banke, where all the personalities as unique, especially they were also unique and all very original on their own terms. To have those not on stage in any way would just be different.
Right. We might have to flash forward like 200 years long after we're gone, that, you know, it'll be a resurgence of just general 60s music, you know, let's do 60s music from the 20th century, just like we perform Beethoven or Mozart or whatever, you know, and because I can envision that in the future, and though people will dressing the part, you know, the Baroque type sound, and, you know, doing
the frilly outfits, and I got to wear a similar kind of outfit for a book I did a few years ago about the North Carolina rock and roll scene of the 60s. And it was like all black with ruffles. I said, this is like if Johnny Cash joined the Left Banke. I'm in. I'm so in. It's funny now. I think about as a kid growing up, you know, I'm second generation 60s fan. I was born in 1972. So I grew up in the 80s going, wow, the 60s, man, that was like 20 years ago. And now it's 55 years ago. The way I looked back then at big band is the way now people look at the 60s. And that still kind of does my head in every so often. But you know what? The music has endured. And people ask me, how is it that people are still fascinated about the music? The music's still good. You know, create good stuff and people will find it. So no matter what the era, you know, of course, you're talking to somebody who's a massive Marx Brothers fan, who has, you know, all these different things. You know, my hat over here is from 1926. And but you learn to, you know, I've always said I try not to draw lines in what I like in life. If something talks to you, no matter what the era, talk back to it, listen to it. And
Right.
I just, thankfully, the 60s still talks to me.
People always say, "Oh, you're being nostalgic." How can you be nostalgic, especially in your case, for something that you weren't even alive? You know?
Exactly. It's
In
like,
my case, I was a baby. I was born at the tail end of '66, so my first memories are from like 1970. So I don't even remember the '60s at all. So
well,
and
it's kind of like for those of us, I have a lot of friends who love the 80s who weren't really around for the 80s.
yeah,
And if you come to me, I'm like, no, I survived the 80s. I don't want to relive that.
yeah,
But, I am a second generation fan. I am fully aware that my view of the 60s is very different from what it was like for these guys to be
yeah.
living and touring and being a rock and roll band in the 60s, dealing with it night in, night out. It's very different than what many of us have an idea of, but they created good work, and that's what drew us in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, both the '60s and '80s, it's fun to listen to just the music and not remember all the the assassinations in the '60s, or what happened in the '80s. Just big changes in rich versus poor and things like that,
Yeah.
to say something general.
Everything got bigger. Everything, the
Yeah.
hair, clothes, it all got better.
It's like, yeah, I like the '80s, but I didn't love the '80s. I like the music from it, but it's just like the '60s. It's like, I love the music, but when you really get into it, it's like, why did they do that? Why did they censor that? Why did they kill that person? Why? It's like, and I don't like to go down that path very often, even though I study it, just to be aware of it.
It was heavy stuff, and that was one of the things in the book I mentioned. It's called "There Was a Time: Rock and Roll in the 1960s in Charlotte and North Carolina." Available on Amazon, by the way. I had a chapter called "Murder in My Heart for the Judge," and it was all about these stories that these kids had about the stuff they dealt with. And some of the stories were very similar to the song that inspired "Murder in My Heart" for the Judge, which was a Moby Grape song.
Yeah.
And I wanted them, that was an important book for me because I realized it's not my story, it's their story.
Yeah.
So that book is multiple interviews woven into a larger narrative, but it's long form,
Right.
meaning that everybody has a chance to speak and tell their story, which is what I wanted. It was a type of book that you just don't see anymore. Most books now, as you know, are single narrator, and that's what a lot of publishers want. And I realized early on that that's not the book that I wanted to write. The stories needed this version, and eventually I published it myself through Fort Canoga Press, which is an imprint name I'm very proud of, because it's a lot of projects that I've created things that I wanted to see other people do. I just happened to be the one doing it. So the stories, and even now people say, oh, what happened around this or that. It's like, it's still amazing, because take it totally out of the context of the world we live in now. There's no cell phones. There's no any of the things that we accept as day-to-day normalcy now, especially pre-pandemic. And it's still like, wow, that really happened. And you were a teenager. What the heck? So, but I love hearing these stories and collecting stories. I'm glad I didn't have to live through it, but I'm glad I've gotten to hear these stories.
Is there a chance, going back to the Left Banke, first of all, is there a book just on the Left Banke, to your knowledge?
There is not.
Okay.
There has been a couple different books that have mentioned their story.
Right.
I'm going to mention an interview that Richie Unterberger did in the 90s, one of the first.
I was going to say, if anybody wrote it, it'd probably be him, but
Yeah, he did an interview with Michael Brown in the late 90s. I think it was on his Wayfaring Strangers book. It was the first Michael Brown interview I'd ever read. And Michael didn't do a lot of interviews. I was never able to sit down and talk to him. I have interviews at length from Tom and George and Rick Brand and other people who were involved with the band. I could never reach Steve Martin, Caro as well. But there is some information out there. But one thing that Alan Merrill, who some of you all will know, is the guy that co-wrote Joan Jett's biggest hit. But there was a point where he was in the Left Banke for about 3 months. Or several weeks in about 1968, and then went off and became a big star in Japan. And I told him I was working on a story in the Left Banke, and he said, "Good luck. The story of the Left Banke is like Rashomon. It's like it is just the perspective changes with each person." And he's absolutely right. So there are some things that have been written, but to get Left Banke story, you have to get it from all sides,
Right.
and that takes some work. I'd like to see someone do it. It's something I've toyed with myself for some time. I don't know if it'll be this year. I think now that we've gotten this release out, I have some other projects I need to work on, including the new album from The Circle that we'll hopefully have done soon. Well, we mentioned that as well. And I've got a large photo exhibition that opens next month. So, but to anybody who's out there and wants to write the story of the Left Banke, go do it.
And then also, I assume that there's no like real video documentary of any sort of the group, correct?
There is. I can
precious little video footage of the band, probably a few performances here and there, but
if you search on YouTube, you'll find a performance of them on the Larry Kane show in 1967 that ran on VH1 in 1986, has never been seen or found again. They were on Where the Action Is with Jeff Winfield. You can find that online. There's also a performance of them on a show in New York doing a live vocal with a taped backing of Shadows Breaking Over My Head. I can't believe I'm blanking on the show now, but it is on YouTube. Do recommend it. And then it's not online, but there is the footage that I found, the 3 minutes of silent footage of the band taped February 25th, 1966. As they taped an episode of Disco Teen, which was a show hosted by Zachary on Channel 47 in New Jersey. So it is out there, but that is it. Yeah. And to anyone who has more or knows of more, please contact me. Please contact anybody associated with the Left Banke. This stuff needs to survive. Yeah.
It seems like if you were able to tie it together and license it together and then do a few interviews and commentary, you could probably get at least a good half hour to maybe an hour, about them, even clips from this podcast, discussing the history and stuff like that.
Yeah, and there's various interviews that they did you can find online, 2011 and 2012. I know I have about 2 hours of audio interviews with both George and Tom. And then I sadly did not record an interview with Rick. I wish I had, but I wrote it out in longhand because he called me one night. I just had come back from work and I picked up the phone and it's like, "Hey, Daniel, it's Rick Brand. You want to talk?" So I just yes, and sat down on the floor and wrote his whole interview out in longhand. And if you've seen my handwriting, that's probably not a good thing, but that's what it was. And so there's definitely pieces of the story out there. Yeah. So
it'd be interesting if that could somehow be compiled in the next few years or something like that. But
I would love.
I'm just throwing it out there,
Yeah,
because as you know, you and I are working on so many different projects, so it's like oh geez, I'd love to see it. I don't know if I'd want to put one together, but
I don't know if you have this problem, Mark, but I have a horrible problem saying no.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, darn, I want to see that happen. Well, I don't have time for it, but yeah, I'll do it anyway.
Well, so, yeah, I mean, that happens too. Yes. It's like, I don't want to work on this, but since you're asking, okay.
Yeah.
I get it. Okay. So I guess that's pretty much everything we're going to talk about. You mentioned The Circle. I was going to bring it up. So talk briefly about that. That'll probably be in our next podcast, probably talking about them and their history and everything, but talk about what you're working with them.
That has been an amazing story. So in 2018, I met The Circle at a show in Van Wert, Ohio, which was as remote as it sounds. And I realized it was a really good band there. It was 2 original members, Don Daneman, the singer and guitarist, and Mike Loskamp, the keyboardist that joined after the Beatles tour. He's on Neon and the Minx soundtrack. Mm-hmm. And I realized there's something that could be done. Somebody should make the album that The Circle was making in 1968 that Columbia never compiled and finished. And I realized that suddenly, well, yeah, somebody should make that record. What if it's me? And I pitched it to them and they said, "You're crazy, but yeah, let's do it." And in March of 2020, we got together in Ohio to literally the weekend before the world went crazy to record 6 songs, including new versions of Red Rubber Ball, Turn Down Day, The Visit, and a song that they were pitched by Paul Simon in 1966, Feeling Groovy, that they turned down. So we finally got them to record it all these years later. And as I knew they had been playing it live, it wasn't planned to be recorded that day. And I just said, "Hey, by the way, run through this, see if it works. It was basically, start the recording session. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And it worked. So we released those all as singles in the last year. And now we've, between Don and the rest of the band and what we've been working on, we have more than a full album now that we hope to have done in the next couple months. Including a couple of surprises. One which I do not want to get into just yet. We'll save that for a later podcast. But one does involve Andrew Sandoval.
Very cool.
And some members of the band that are no longer with us, but may well be part of this album. So
if you could bring Andrew with you next time you're on the show,
I would love to do that. Like, kind of, because of the pandemic, I only got to wave at him at this last Monkeys tour. He and I have a lot to catch up on, but Andrew stays very busy. He's apparently getting ready to work on another book, and I hope he's doing okay. I wish him well. I'm always thinking of him. So
he's doing okay. I mean, I saw I got his Monkeys book, this huge tome that's like a
fantastic.
Book. And the last time I saw him in person, though, was at a Peter Tork solo concert. This has been 6 years ago, 2016, I guess. So 5 years ago, 5, 6. Anyway.
Yeah, Andrew's not that much older than I am. He just had his birthday yesterday. My birthday's November, so we're both preparing for our 50th anniversary reunion tours, as it were. But he and I both share that perspective of we weren't there for the 60s, but we grew up with this music, and it's something. It's literally it's part. We grew up with it so much it's part of our DNA.
Yeah,
and he's somebody that while I don't get to talk to very often, or even get to email correspond with him very often, I know he's doing great things, and that's always good to know. So yes, if we could get together for a podcast, I would do it yesterday. I would love to have that conversation with him. But Andrew, if you're listening someday, hope you're doing well.
Yep. So I guess to wrap it up, you can just repeat all the kind of stuff that's coming out about the Left Banke, and any projects you're working on, and any websites and contact information, like good stuff.
Yes. So as I mentioned, this Strangers on a Train, now finally issued through Omnivore Recordings on February 25th. That CD also includes 6 songs that Mike and Steve recorded in 2001. You can also get those songs separately as the High Flyer EP, or as part of the complete Strangers on a Train CD. Again, February 25th. Please, check with me on danielcoston.com for updates. Definitely any place where you follow the Left Banke, watch that space. There's more to come. So I also mentioned the official Left Banke fan page, which Tom started in 2010 and is now run by Cookie, who was their fan club president in 1967, and God bless her. So thank you, Cookie. Thank you, everybody who's been part of the Left Banke story. Again, check thecircle.com for updates on our new album. We'll be posting updates soon. If you're in anywhere near Shelby, North Carolina in the next 6-7 months, I'll be doing an exhibition of Avett Brothers photos. This is the first time that I photographed the first Avett Brothers records, and I am the first person they've given permission to do a show of this size that is just about focusing on them, that doesn't involve their own work. So it's called Symphony for the Road, and you can go see it at the Earl Scruggs Center, opening on February 7th, 2022, and it'll be up for 6 months. On my own, I am working on this and that, and again, you can find me Daniel Coston on Facebook, danielcoston.com, Daniel Coston Photos on Instagram. Come by, say hello. Hope you're doing okay. Cheers.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Always a pleasure having you as a guest, and look forward to having you again, and maybe Andrew Sandoval, to discuss anybody and everybody from the 60s or the Circle or whatever you want to talk about when you're all on here. It's fine, and we talk about anything. We could even talk about Marx Brothers sometime on here.
I would love to discuss the Marx Brothers. So I currently have 2 autographs of theirs on my desk, of Chico and Zeppo. I also have a program that I found on Etsy last year from their first Broadway show, and I'll Say She Is, and it's just in glorious, programs in glorious color, and things like that. It doesn't matter what era inspires you, as long as it inspires you. So keep searching, keep digging.
we'll save that for another time. So
Yeah.
thank you again, Daniel, for being on the show. And that wraps up another Fun Ideas podcast. We'll see you soon.
See you, man.